Friday, the 6th of January 2012 arrived far too soon. As his last ever shift at Huddersfield drew to a close, Gareth completed his rounds of the station, bidding farewell to his colleagues in the booking office and the concourse. He and Andy parted with a long, warm handshake. "Don't forget the little guys," Andy told him. In joining the team at control, Gareth would be making decisions that would affect the station staff. "I won't," Gareth promised. The two friends grinned at each other, their sadness at parting tempered by the fact that their roles would require them to remain in regular contact. Nevertheless, their flights of fancy would never quite reach the same heights as they had at Huddersfield. With an increasingly heavy heart, Gareth walked back into the announcer's office, ready to pick up his bag and catch his train home, which would be leaving in the next few minutes from platform 1. Martin was there to take over the next shift, as well as Angie and Angela, and of course, Felix too, ready to see him off. "Right then," Gareth said brusquely. He bent down and picked up his constant friend, Felix. Used to these nightly cuddles goodbye, she didn't realise this is the last time. But Gareth knew. He felt suddenly tearful. Felix sat in his arms, raised herself up on her back legs and put her 2 front paws on his chest. They stared at each other, green eyes into blue. Then Gareth took her paw and shook it, formally, as he took his leave of this most special of colleagues. "Goodbye, little cat," he said, and was surprised to find that his voice cracked as he said the words. Behind him in the office, Angela Dunn started crying. Gareth didn't know what else to say to Felix. There weren't the words to tell her what she meant to him, how much she had helped him, how she had given him the courage to believe in himself again. "Thank you," was all he said, and he found that those big green eyes of hers swam slightly as his own flooded suddenly with unshed tears. There was a soft clunk as the office door closed. Angie Hunt, saying nothing, having no words either, just ran out of the office and left them to it. But the door being opened let in another sound, the arrival of Gareth's train. As its doors chimed, he knew he had to run. He squeezed the cat in his arms one final time, kissed her on the head, and put her down gently on the floor of the office. There was just one last opportunity to give her a rub behind her ears. She leaned into his hand as if squeezing him back, and then he ran and got on the train. There came the beep of the closing doors, the lurch of the engine, and then, as he sat in his seat, staring blindly out of the window at the station he knew so well, the train pulled unstoppably away, taking him from Felix, from his friend. There was no shame in it, Gareth thought, as he gave himself up to tears. This was simply what happened when you found you had to leave a little cat like Felix. Chapter 16, on the night shift. "What are we going to do tonight, Felix?" Angie Hunt asked, the not so little anymore black and white cat. Felix looked up at her as though she completely understood Angie's words. "Are you coming with me?" Felix got to her feet. Yes, she was, and off the pair trotted to complete their security checks. With Gareth Hope gone, Felix now strengthened her relationships with the team leaders even more. Most of that bonding took place on the night shift, a shift that the team fulfilled on rotation. When a hush would fall over the station and the big front doors were shut tight, especially in those cold winter months of early 2012, Felix wouldn't always be outside on the deserted platforms during the wee small hours. Often she and Angie would be in the warm team leader's office instead, where Angie would be working on the computer. The team leaders' jobs were complex, including accounting, finance, revenue, and retail duties, amongst many others, and Angie often had to focus hard as she went through her night shift responsibilities. But Felix was not the sort of cat to let you focus hard. She'd sit up on the desk. "What do you want, lovely?" Angie would ask her distractedly, her attention fixed on whatever spreadsheet was on screen. Felix would raise one snowy white paw and place it carefully on Angie's arm as though she wanted to tell her something very, very important. "What is it, sweetheart? Are you after something?" Angie would turn and face the cat, and Felix would repeat the movement a little more firmly. "Do you want a cuddle?" Felix would nestle close into Angie and then reach up even higher to touch her nose, claws safely tucked away, using the velvety pad of her paw. "Give over," Angie would say, rubbing her nose. "I don't know where you've been." She would turn back to the screen, but prod, prod, prod. Those little paws would soon be back at work. Then all of a sudden, Felix would roll over onto her back, stretching out across the desk. "Oh ho," Angie would say, "you want your tummy rubbing, is that what it is?" She'd reach out her hand and stroke Felix on the soft underside of her fluffy white belly, and Felix's tail would hang off the desk, flicking from side to side happily. "Felix," Angie would say after a few moments, "you do know that I've got work to do, don't you? I have got work to do." But for the next few minutes at least, Felix the Railway Cat would demand that the only team member Angie would be leading that evening would be her. Back and forth that tail would go, just like a wagging dog's. It was the opinion of Jean Randall in the booking office that Felix was having a bit of an identity crisis. There were never any other cats on the station concourse, but by this time in her life, Felix had observed a fair few dogs being taken on day trips on the train. They wagged their tails when they were happy. Felix did the same. They followed their owners around obediently, trotting at their heels. Felix did the same. They sat on command, especially if a reward was on offer, and Felix did the same. It was as if she thought she was a puppy. And, just like a little dog, one of Felix's favourite games on the night shift was a flat-out race. It was usually team leader Andy Krugen who would challenge her to the contest. It would be bang in the middle of the night, with the station absolutely deserted. Platform 1 would be empty and wide and just too tempting to resist. If Felix was hanging around at the top of the stairs on the platform and Andy happened to find her there on his way back to the office, he would assume a position behind her as though they were each in lanes at the starting blocks. "I'll race you to the office, Felix," he'd tell her seriously. The office was located at the other end of the platform, so it was a fair distance, enough time to get up a bit of speed. "Reckon you can beat me?" he challenged. Felix would look over at him with a withering stare. "What do you think, mister?" she seemed to say. She'd be up on her feet and Andy would crouch down a little, the two of them locking eyes. "On your marks, get set, go," Andy would cry. Then he and Felix would sprint along the deserted platform to the office door. Felix just loved it. She'd bound along as fast as her little legs would carry her, and she was fast. All that time sleeping meant that when she was awake, she had heaps of energy, and the team found they had to find ways of helping her burn it off, or they'd get no peace. They would still throw her favourite brown bear for her to catch, and they'd also throw the odd treat down the long corridor too, so that she would run for it, like a marine released for war before taking down her prey with one military manoeuvre, a satisfying swallow and a lick of her lips. Then her tongue would be out again, almost as though she was panting. "Come on, I'm ready for the next one." And they'd fling a second treat, and all you could hear was a clattering as Felix went tearing down the corridor again. Felix was good company on the night shift. There were only 2 human team members on duty, and each had their own responsibilities, so it could be lonely and even at times intimidating shift to work. But with Felix there, it was as if she were an extra person. She kept them going. "Come on, lovely, let's go down here," Angie would say, as they wandered into one isolated corner or another. Felix would follow, and her presence would take their minds off what could be waiting in the dark. Before the doors were shut at midnight, one of the major jobs of the team leaders was to organise the shunt movements of the carriages. At Huddersfield, there are some sidings, essentially a train car park, alongside the main tracks. Innumerable trains came in at night, which would then lie dormant until the early morning service the following day, and the team leaders had to find them all somewhere to sleep. Yet it was a complicated process. The trains would arrive in a higgledy-piggledy order, but the team leaders had to make sure that they slept in a pattern that would enable the early morning services to run on time. The team leaders were told the night before which train would be leaving at 5 a.m. and which at 5:25, for example, so they had to ensure that the 5 a.m. train wasn't stuck behind the 5:25, even if the earlier train had come in first. The shunt movements were the movements of all these carriages late at night, and executing the movements successfully was rather like completing a Rubik's Cube, as one twisted and transported the trains first one way and then another. An additional complication was that customer services were still running while the shunt movements were going on, and these, of course, took priority. Platforms 1, 4 and 8 had to be kept clear at all times for express services, and God forbid there were any hold-up. In order to keep track of it all, one of the team leaders' jobs was to sort out what was called a unit diagram. A unit meant the train or carriage was a diagram of all the station platforms and the sidings showing which unit had to sleep where, so that they could be shunted into the relevant positions before the station shut down for the night. Frankly, Felix felt exhausted just watching them do it. She, of course, remained safely on platform 1, observing the activity from a distance as the team leader directed proceedings and the shunt drivers, in their orange high-vis outfits, moved the trains to the sidings, then crunched back along the gravel tracks to return to the platforms. It was a collocative sort of atmosphere late at night, and Felix's ears would twitch as she heard the cheery human voices carrying easily in the still air. And then again as the drivers started to leave and their car engines would fire up, then fade away to nothing. After that, it was just Felix, the 2 team members and the cleaners on duty, who steadily made their way around all the sleeping trains, dragging Henry the Hoover behind them. As for Henry, Felix would follow him closely with her eyes as he rattled along the platforms, as though he was some sort of scarlet, smiley animal that she had to keep tabs on. But he never did anything but noisily trundle along before disappearing inside the dark, slumbering trains. Felix perhaps liked the station best at night. There were no roaring trains. The crows were fast asleep. It was a time when it truly became her domain, and she asserted herself as soon as the heavy front doors were locked. Every night, as soon as a huge pole had been bolted across the towering doors, Felix would prowl around, running her own security checks as though to find out, what have those humans been doing with my kingdom today? She investigated every corner of the concourse, casing the joint with her emerald eyes, leaving no stone unturned. She padded silently on her 4 white paws, though often in the daytime, if she shook her head or leapt from floor to desk, her pink metal heart tag would jangle against her collar. At night, she seemed to have perfected the art of the silent assassin, and not a footfall could be heard as she tiptoed through the station. She moved thoughtfully, not rushing as she sometimes did. The station cat was very much in charge. Silence reigned everywhere. The ticket office windows had been closed since 8 p.m. The room behind their drawn shades was dark and still. At either end of platform 1, both pubs had long since shut for business, and the clink of the beer bottles joining their fellows in the recycling bins and the raucous laughter of the revellers had long since faded away. Above Felix's head, as she continued to stalk along platform 1, the train display boards no longer showed a continuous list of services. the orange digits updating every few minutes. Only 3 services ran at night, and in between their arrival and departure, Felix ruled the roost. She faded into the shadows along platform 1, her inky black fur camouflaging her in the dark. Only every now and again would an observer see a flash of white at her tail, neck, or paws. If she was looking in a certain direction, her white patches concealed from view. You wouldn't spot her at all. Only when she moved would you realise cat, not shadow. But there was still plenty of jobs for the station cat to do. The team in the office would print out the reservation stubs at night, and Felix took it upon herself to oversee proceedings. She liked to watch as the details were printed out on the thick white card, as though checking that no customer was going to be without their booked seat, not on her watch. The metro man would drop off his delivery of newspapers, and Felix would sometimes observe as he threw them into the pink metal display holder that stored them in the concourse, ready for the commuters to collect in a few hours' time. Felix was always fed at night too, so she made it her #1 priority to hassle whichever team leader was on duty as soon as she felt a bit peckish. She would meow demandingly for food, her tail wagging constantly in anticipation, licking her lips until her meaty meal, made by the cat food company, Felix, had been squeezed from its shiny pouch into her bowl, and she could devour it hungrily. At 5 a.m. every morning, the team leader would once again walk to the main entrance and slide back the bolt to throw open the doors. The night shift was almost over. The station lights were on a timer, so as soon as the first streaks of sunrise started to show themselves in the sky, a sensor would be alerted. As daylight began to spill across the station, the electric lights would automatically switch off. In the April of 2012, however, the night shift being over didn't mean that night time was. Sunrise was around 6:30 when the month began, so it was still dark as Felix and her colleagues at the station went about opening up their world again, pulling up the shades in the ticket office, which opened at 5:45 a.m, firing up the coffee machines in the catering concessions so that the scent of freshly ground beans began to fill the air, wiping down the paintwork and the walls with a clean damp cloth to make sure that everything was shipshape before the working day really began. The sleeping trains on the platform stirred, engines starting to rumble and whir. Many headed off immediately, due to begin their services at other stations, while others waited expectantly for the customers who would be boarding at Huddersfield. Felix was often on duty for the morning rush hour too, though she tended to avoid the evening crush. As she waited by the bike racks, seeing the sun come up, the little station cat seemed very much at home. She listened as Martin made his announcements, watched as her colleagues strode about, assisting and guiding customers on the platforms. Everybody was hard at work. Felix was too, of course. She had a routine by now, which usually involved a stint or two at the customer information desk. She had proved that she was great with customers, and she had saved the day in several stressful situations. All in all, she was a fantastic colleague. Everyone agreed. There was just one problem. With Felix approaching her first birthday, the so-called pest controller had still not caught a single mouse. Chapter 17, The Pest Controller. It wasn't as though she hadn't tried. Felix was well practiced at her prowling technique. She knew how to drop to her belly and creep along, knew, in her head at least, that she had to stay still until the last possible moment and then pounce. But none of her oh-so-serious stalking sessions was ever successful. She'd given it her best shot with the rabbits, but they had bounded away infuriatingly fast. Next, she turned her attention to the pigeons, much less scary than the crows. It was easier said than done to catch a bird, however, not least because the savvy pigeons tended to save their scavenging trips for when the railway cat was AWOL. You'd sometimes get one doing a reconnaissance trip, soaring the length of a platform with its cat-seeking radar on high alert, a drum roll sound echoing under the iron roof as its flapping wings beat out a rhythm. If she was there, the bird would keep on flying, doing a graceful curve at the end of platform 1 before ascending into the girders in the roof, where he would join his fellows to coo the warning, "Not yet." But every now and again, one brave or foolish pigeon would totter along the platform within Felix's sights, its head bobbing like a woodpecker's as it greedily tried to pick up crumbs from the platform, moving its beak so fast it was a blur. Felix would be hiding in the bike racks. They acted as a kind of camouflage to conceal her from pigeons as well as noisy trains and people. She would crouch on all fours, the tension in her limbs palpable, as slowly, slowly, slowly she sneaked forwards like the predator she knew in her bones she was. There was a certain pride in her movements, a command in authority, as though with every calculated step she was broadcasting the message, "Look at me, I'm a predator. Watch out, world." But somehow, even though Felix's brain was saying, "Easy, easy," the closer the cat grew to the pigeon, the more excited she became. Maybe this time she would do it. Her impatience and pure exhilaration at being in the hunt would bubble up and get the better of her, and way too soon she would spring up and rush headlong at the bird. It was always long gone before she got anywhere near it. So to cover her humiliation at once more losing her prey, Felix would be forced to sit down incongruently and start washing herself, trying to give the impression that she'd just fancied a change of scene for her ablutions. "Pigeon? What pigeon? I don't know what you're talking about," said her two focused licks of her fur. She had nailed the nonchalant nothing to see here look, at least. She'd even tried to have a go at dogs. Well, they were another animal, weren't they? And they were on her patch. She'd try all her usual stalking techniques, but they would always end in failure. Felix would be concentrated hard on the canines in her cross sights, but had she looked up at their human escorts, she would have seen the shock writ plain across their faces at seeing the station cat trying to hunt their darling dogs. Depending on the size of the canine in question, the object of Felix's attention would sometimes find itself swooped up into its owner's protective arms. But the dogs were hardly in danger, despite Felix's best attempts, and she spent hours practicing pinning down her soft mice toys, a skill she had mastered since kittenhood. She seemed unable to catch a thing. It was all a bit of a poor show for a pest controller. Felix's failure to hit her targets hadn't gone unnoticed by the team. "Waste of space, you are," Billy would say to her, though there'd be a smile in his voice. He'd shake his head in mock disgust. "Call yourself a pest controller? Useless, absolutely useless." But Billy was forced to eat his words one day. He and Angela Dunn had been out on platform 1 and were making their way back into the office when they suddenly noticed that Felix was acting most peculiarly in her lair by the bike racks. She was absolutely transfixed by something on the ground and looked almost as if she was smiling. "What's she got there?" Angela asked Billy as the two of them paused, then crept closer to the cat. There, laid out before Felix like a sacrificial offering on a silver platter, was a mouse. It was still alive and it looked uninjured so far, but it had clearly wandered right into Felix's field of operations and was very, very much regretting that decision. Felix, on the other hand, was delighted. She gazed down at the mouse, not letting it out of her sight. But had she made eye contact with Billy, she might well have been tempted to tell him, with a flash of her green eyes, that she very much hoped he savoured his enormous slice of humble pie. The only problem was that now Felix had caught the mouse, she wasn't quite sure what to do with it. She lifted one of her white capped front paws. The mouse's eyes alert trembled where it lay on the platform, fearing the blow that must surely come. But Felix merely patted it with her paw, as she did with Angie's arm when she wanted a cuddle. The mouse shivered and quivered, but Felix didn't scratch or skewer it. She simply patted it gently with her paw. She moved it along the platform. She pushed and poked at it. She looked rather like an engineer pondering a complex piece of machinery, thinking, but what does it do? How does it work? Slowly, the mouse started to recover its equilibrium as Angela and Billy watched, and Felix kept on with her somewhat simple-minded patting. The mouse assessed its options. Like an SAS expert, it quickly recalled to mind its own mental blueprints of the immediate station vicinity and the nearby location of all the mouse-sized subways, tunnels and holes. Tap, tap, went Felix's paw. She looked down quizzically at her prey. And then the mouse legged it. Operation Escape the Cat was underway. Stunned at some movement, Felix narrowed her eyes and tried to follow the darting mouse, but it was far too quick for her. In the wall at Felix's back, just behind the bike rack, was a small metal grate with holes just big enough for a tiny rodent to squeeze through. Felix dashed to the wall, but it was too late. As she pressed her frustrated face to the bricks and the metal grate, the mouse was home and dry. Angela and Billy burst into laughter. "Oh, Felix," cried Angela affectionately. "Blooming heck, love, you're not supposed to let them go." Poor old Felix. But the pest controller of Huddersfield Station was a clever cat, and now she had some hands-on experience, like the most eager intern, and she was as keen as mustard to land a real job with the skills she had learned. She stayed by the bike racks. It had worked for her with mouse number 1, and she trusted its sturdy metal docking gates like firm friends. Felix shrewdly started using the bike racks to help her in her quest to catch her first mouse. She used to trap the rodents by the silver limbs of the bike rack and pin them there with her paw. She was starting to feel she'd got the hang of this mouse catching business now. For a game, she would let them go a certain distance, then she'd pin them again. Let them go, bring them back, let them go, bring them back. Felix started to enjoy herself. Then one day, by the bike racks, when Felix was about a year old, she jumped all over the mouse she'd caught. She just went for it, fearlessly, claws and teeth and all, and it was game over for the mouse. It was an instinctive assassination. And that's where I'm going to leave it.